In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You learned that in school. First fact about exploration you ever memorized, and it's fine as facts go, except it's the wrong story. The real discovery happened 3 centuries earlier. No ships with crosses on their sails, no royal commission from any European monarch. Just 2 groups of people who had absolutely no business finding each other.
Finding each other anyway, somewhere in the vast open Pacific.
And we know this not from a diary, not from a shipwreck, not from a stone carving. We know this from blood, specifically from the blood of people alive today. In 2020, a team of geneticists published a paper in the journal Nature. They'd been collecting DNA samples from communities across Polynesia, Easter Island, the Marquesas, Palmerino, the Cook Islands, and comparing those genomes against reference populations from South America. What they found broke open a question that had been sitting in anthropology like an unexploded device for the better part of a century. The Polynesian islanders didn't just have Polynesian DNA. Hidden inside their genomes, woven in like a signature on a painting, was a clear, unmistakable signal from indigenous peoples of South America. Specifically, from a population closely related to the Zenu people of present-day Colombia. The mixing event, they calculated, happened around 1200 CE, give or take a few decades. Columbus wouldn't be born for another 250 years. So who crossed the Pacific, and why did it take us this long to figure out? Let's start with the Polynesians, because if you don't know who they actually were, the whole story doesn't land the way it should. The Polynesians were the greatest navigators in the history of the planet. Full stop. No asterisk. Between roughly 1000 BCE and 1200 CE, they colonized the largest ocean on Earth, an area covering more than a third of the globe's surface.
Using wooden canoes, star charts memorized in their skulls, and a reading of wave patterns so precise that navigators could detect the presence of an island from hundreds of miles away by feeling how the swells bent around it.
They settled Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, then pushed further. Hawaii, New Zealand, the Marquesas. Easter Island, which sits in the middle of absolutely nothing, 2,300 miles from the coast of Chile, 300 miles from the nearest inhabited island. They found it, they settled it, they built the moai, the stone giants. Easter Island is the key coordinate here. Remember that location. Because when researchers started pulling apart the DNA of Easter Island's modern population, the Rapa Nui people,
the South American signal was strongest there.
The closer a Polynesian community was to South America geographically, the more pronounced that indigenous American ancestry showed up in the genome. That's not a coincidence, that's a direction. But before the DNA study, before anyone was sequencing genes in a laboratory, there were already 2 pieces of evidence sitting in plain sight.
And scientists had been arguing about them for decades.
The first is a word.
In the Quechua language, spoken by the indigenous peoples of the Andes, the language of the Inca Empire, the sweet potato is called kumar. In Polynesian languages, across dozens of islands spread across millions of square miles of ocean, the sweet potato is called kumara, same root,
same vegetable. The sweet potato is native to South America. It originated there. And yet when European explorers arrived in Polynesia in the 1500s, they found sweet potatoes already growing everywhere, already integrated into diets, into agriculture, into culture. The Polynesians had a name for it that sounded almost identical to the Andean name. The plant couldn't swim, someone carried it. The second piece of evidence is a chicken bone. In 2007, archaeologists excavating a site called El Arenal on the coast of Chile dug up chicken bones that radiocarbon dated to somewhere between 1304 and 1424 CE. Before Columbus, before any European contact with the Americas. Chickens aren't native to the Americas.
Chickens were domesticated in Southeast Asia and carried westward. So how did pre-Columbian chicken bones end up buried on the Chilean coast?
The team extracted mitochondrial DNA from the bones and compared it against chicken populations worldwide. The closest genetic match wasn't European chickens, which arrived with the Spanish. It was Polynesian chickens, specifically chickens from Tonga and Samoa. So you have a plant that went from South America to Polynesia, and a bird that went from Polynesia to South America. Something or someone was moving between these two worlds. Long before 1492, long before any European even believed there was an ocean this large. Here's where it gets complicated in a way that the 2020 DNA study actually helped resolve. Because for a long time, the debate wasn't whether contact happened. By the early 2000s, most serious researchers accepted the sweet potato and the chicken as evidence that it had. The debate was about who did the sailing. Two camps, two very different stories about what kind of people could cross the Pacific. One camp argued the Polynesians did it, that they pushed their canoes east from Easter Island or the Marquesas, reached the South American coast, made contact with indigenous populations there, traded plants and animals and maybe people, and then sailed back. This fits the Polynesian track record. They were the ones with the ocean infrastructure, the deep navigation knowledge, the vessels designed for open water distance. The other camp, most famously championed by the Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl, argued it was the other way around, that South Americans sailed west into the Pacific. In 1947, Heyerdahl built a balsa wood raft he called the Kon-Tiki, based on pre-Columbian designs, and sailed it from Peru to Polynesia with 5 crew members to prove it was physically possible. He made it. The Kon-Tiki crossed 300 miles of ocean in 101 days. Heyerdahl became famous. He won an Academy Award for the documentary. For a while, his theory, that Polynesians descended from South Americans, became almost mainstream. The DNA study of 2020 closed that debate. Not cruelty to Heyerdahl's legacy, just cleanly, with genomic math.
The researchers found that the South American ancestry in Polynesian populations was real, but it was a small percentage.
Around 5% in some communities. And it was woven into genomes that were otherwise entirely Polynesian, not the other way around. The Polynesians weren't descended from South Americans. They were Polynesian people who at some point around 1200 CE encountered and mixed with a South American population, then continued spreading across the Pacific, carrying that genetic trace with them. The founding Polynesian lineage came from Southeast Asia and spread east. The South American DNA arrived later, as an addition, not an origin. Heyerdahl was right that the crossing was possible. He was wrong about who led it. But here's the thing, the 2020 study also revealed that most headlines missed. This wasn't one grand meeting. The researchers found evidence suggesting multiple contact events between Polynesian and South American populations over a period of roughly 2 to 3 centuries. Not a single expedition. A pattern, which means this wasn't accident or storm drift. You don't stumble across the South American coastline, make contact, exchange genes, and then stumble back again 3 more times over 200 years. There was something intentional here. Some kind of relationship. Trade, maybe. Seasonal voyages. A known route. We will probably never know the details. There are no written records from either side describing these meetings. No Polynesian oral tradition has been definitively identified that narrates contact with South Americans. No indigenous South American account survives, if it ever existed, that describes people arriving from the ocean west. What we have is DNA, a word for a root vegetable, and the bones of a chicken. And from those 3 things, geneticists and archaeologists and linguists have reconstructed the fact of a meeting that rewrites the story of human exploration. Think about the scale of what that meeting required. A Polynesian navigator, let's say he's in his late 30s, experienced, has made the run from the Cook Islands to the Marquesas before, decides to push east. Further than anyone has pushed. He has a double-hulled canoe, maybe 20 meters long, loaded with food and water for months. He has his crew, he has the stars, he has the wave patterns, he has nothing else. No GPS coordinates for a continent that doesn't appear in his mental map of the world. He sails east because that's where the ocean goes, and because the Polynesians as a civilization had a cultural relationship with the unknown that most human societies in the 13th century simply did not have. They pursued it. They built their entire identity around surviving it. And at some point, maybe after 6 weeks, maybe after 10, he sees birds, then a different color in the water, then mountains. What did that moment feel like? What did the people on the coast feel when they saw his canoe? There's no answer to that. But the meeting happened. We know it happened because it left a mark in the genetic code.
Of people whose descendants are still alive today, raising their children, going about their lives, carrying in their DNA the memory of a crossing that no one wrote down.
The 2021 follow-up study expanded the sample size and used more precise genetic dating tools. It narrowed the contact window further, most likely between 1150 and 1230 CE.
And found that the South American population involved was most closely related to people from the region that is now Colombia and Ecuador, not Peru, which slightly undercut some of the more Inca-centric versions of the story.
Heyerdahl had imagined Inca sailors specifically. The genetics suggest it was a different population, perhaps less famous, perhaps from a culture we don't even have a name for yet. That's what tends to happen in science when you finally get real data. The clean story gets complicated, and then it gets more interesting. Because here's what the Columbus question was always really about. It was never just about who sailed first, or who discovered what. It was about a deeper assumption that the world before European contact was a collection of isolated civilizations, walled off from each other by oceans too large to cross, waiting to be connected. That assumption is wrong. It was always wrong. The Polynesian expansion alone should have demolished it. And now the DNA evidence says that the Pacific, this impossible, horizonless, 3 months wide body of water, was not a barrier between the ancient world and the Americas. It was a road. Somewhere around 1200 CE, people from opposite sides of the largest ocean on Earth found each other. They spent enough time together to fall in love, or at least to blur the genetic line between their populations. They exchanged a plant, a word, maybe a bird. Then they parted, and that meeting slipped out of history, out of memory, until a team of scientists in 2020 found it hiding in someone's DNA. Columbus gets a holiday. These navigators got erased. But the blood remembers. If this rewrites how you think about who explored the world and when, drop a comment. I want to know which part of this hit hardest for you.
And if you think Heyerdahl was more right than wrong, defend that in the comments too, because that's actually a conversation worth having.